The summer of 1982 had been the kind that broke things. It broke the creek beds first, cracked them into pale puzzle pieces by the middle of June. Then it broke the corn, blade by blade, curling the leaves into brittle scrolls that rasped against each other in the hot wind like old paper. By August, it had started breaking the men. Harlan's Creek, Iowa, was a town of 400 and some souls, the kind of place where the grain elevator was taller than the church steeple and people still told time by the sound of the co-op whistle. The town sat in the middle of 3,000 acres of farmland that had been worked by the same families for 4 and 5 generations. The Murphys had their quarter section on the North Road. The Hendersons ran their hogs on the east. The Coopers, the Bairds, the Walkers, they were all woven into the county soil like the roots of the big cottonwoods down by the river. They had survived the Depression. They had survived 2 wars. They had survived the 70s, barely, when diesel hit $1.40 a gallon and everybody said that was the end of everything. But in 1982, the interest rates were eating them alive. Elias Thorne kept his truck radio on while he drove the county roads, the way he had for 30 years. He listened to Who out of Des Moines on clear nights, and on mornings like this one, bright, merciless, already pushing 90 degrees before 8 o'clock, he listened to the farm report. The man on the radio had a calm voice that didn't match what he was saying. Prime lending rate at 15.75%. Corn futures down. Soybean futures down. Another 200 farm bankruptcies filed in the state last month. The voice said it the way a man reads a weather report. A chance of showers. A chance of losing everything your grandfather built. Elias turned down the gravel road toward the old Baird place, one hand on the wheel of his 1968 Ford F-100. The truck had rust above the wheel wells and a cracked passenger mirror and a heater that hadn't worked since 1974, but the engine was sound. He had kept it sound. The tailgate was held shut with a length of baling wire, the same wire he used for a dozen small repairs around the farm. His wife, June, had always said Elias could fix anything with baling wire, fence staples, and silence. She had been gone 4 years now, and he still reached for the passenger seat sometimes on long drives, expecting her to be there. The Baird property auction had drawn most of the county. Walt Baird had died in the spring, and his widow, unable to carry the debt, had agreed to let the bank liquidate the estate. People came the way people always came to misfortune in a small town, partly out of necessity, partly out of grief, and partly because they could not look away. Folding tables were set up in the yard under the shade of a catalpa tree. Martha Hudgens was behind one of the tables, her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, her record book open, her pen ready. She had been the mail carrier for Harlan's Creek for 31 years and the county auction record keeper for 20. She had written down the names of nearly everything that had ever been sold, traded, or lost in this county, and she kept it all in ledgers that she stored in her basement in alphabetical order. "Morning, Elias," she said when she saw him climb down from the Ford. "Morning, Martha." That was the whole conversation. Elias got a cup of coffee from the folding table, black, in a styrofoam cup that was not the same as the enamel camping mug he kept on the windowsill at home, but it was hot, and he drank it standing in the shade and watched the crowd. Richard Vance arrived 20 minutes late, which Elias thought was probably intentional. He drove a 1982 Cadillac Coupe de Ville, white, with a CB antenna on the trunk. He was 42 years old and wore a sport coat the color of buttermilk despite the heat. He had driven up from Kansas City 3 weeks ago and taken a room at the Harlan's Creek Motor Lodge, and in 3 weeks he had managed to acquire, by Elias's count, 6 farms. He did it with lawyers and paperwork, and with that particular brand of city man cheerfulness that felt like a small insult every time you encountered it. He shook hands too firmly and smiled too broadly, and called everyone by their first name on the first meeting. He had a habit of lighting a cigar and then holding it more than smoking it, as if it were a prop. The auction moved through the morning. Tractor attachments, a grain auger, 3 sets of harness that nobody had used in 20 years, a kitchen set, a parlor organ. People bought things they needed and some things they didn't, because buying something from Walt Baird's estate felt like a small act of preservation, of holding on to a piece of what had been. Richard Vance bid on the combine and got it for $4,000 below what it was worth. Nobody had been able to outbid him. The safe came up just before noon. It was a heavy thing, old style, the kind that had been bolted to a floor decades ago, and then pried loose at some point, leaving the bottom scraped and dented. It was iron, the color of old blood, and the combination lock had either seized or been damaged at some point. It had no key and no combination. The auctioneer, a reedy man named Douglas who did livestock sales primarily and seemed faintly embarrassed by the whole business, tapped it with his pen. All right, folks, lot 47. Old floor safe, manufacturer unknown, combination unknown, contents unknown. Who wants to start me at $50? Silence. A few people looked at it and looked away. Richard Vance blew a smoke ring at the sky and studied his fingernails. 25. Nothing. A boy in the back giggled. It was then that Elias Thorne raised his hand. $100, he said. There was a beat of silence, and then laughter. Not cruel laughter, exactly, but the uncomfortable kind, the kind that comes when someone does something that doesn't fit the script. A few heads turned. Richard Vance lowered his cigar and looked at the old man with the F-100 and the Carhartt jacket with the frayed right cuff, and he laughed the loudest. $100 for a doorstop, Vance said, loud enough for everyone to hear. That's rich. That's real rich. Sold, said Douglas the auctioneer, quickly, before anyone could do or say anything else. $100 to Elias Thorne. Martha Hudgens wrote it down in her ledger. She looked up at Elias for just a moment. He was already walking toward the safe, pulling on a pair of work gloves. He didn't say a word to anyone. He lifted one end of the safe with his knees and got it to the tailgate of the F-100, and then Tommy Garrett, the boy from the neighboring property, 19 years old and built for hard work, appeared without being asked and helped him wrestle it into the truck bed. Elias gave Tommy a nod. What do you figures in it, Elias? Someone called out. He climbed into the cab and started the engine. The Ford rumbled to life the way it always had, without hesitation, and he drove down the gravel road with the laughter still trailing behind him like dust. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to old barns in the evening. It is not the quiet of an empty room or a closed library. It is a living quiet, layered with decades of sound absorbed into the wood, the stomp of draft horses, the clatter of a hay fork dropping on a plank floor, the creak of the overhead track on a humid August night. When you stand inside an old barn after supper, the smell is its own world. The mineral sharpness of old motor oil, the sweet dusk of dry alfalfa stacked in the mow, the faint ghost of cattle who hadn't been there in years. There was pine resin from the old boards and iron from the tools hanging on their nails on the east wall, a row of hoes, a cultivator blade, a cant hook his father had used and his grandfather before that. Elias Thorne had built this barn in 1951, with his father and two of his father's neighbors, in the old way, where every man who could swing a hammer came, and you fed them lunch and dinner, and the work got done in 2 days. The elm sill plates were still solid. The mortise and tenon joints had never loosened. He had replaced the roof tin in 1967 and 2 of the haymow doors in 1978. Everything else was original. He knew every board and every nail. He had set the safe down in the center of the barn floor, on a square of old rubber belting he kept for cushioning. He went to the house and ate supper, a can of Campbell's soup and 2 slices of bread and a cup of instant coffee. And then he came back to the barn and looked at the safe for a while before doing anything. It was about 2 feet tall and 18 inches wide. The paint was long gone, and the rust was deep on the outside but pockmarked rather than penetrating. The metal underneath was still thick. The combination dial was frozen solid. He tapped the door with a ball-peen hammer and listened to the tone. Dense. Whatever had been stored in there, someone had taken the trouble to seal it well. He got the acetylene torch out of its cabinet, the old Victor set he'd bought in 1963 from a welder in Waterloo who was going out of business. He checked the hoses, checked the fittings, cracked the oxygen valve, and then the fuel, and lit the tip with his striker. The flames settled to a clean blue cone about the size of his thumb. He did not rush. That was the thing about working with a torch. You could not rush it. The metal had its own schedule, and your job was to pay attention and follow along. He started at the hinge side of the door, working the flame in a slow arc, watching the color of the metal shift from gray to orange to a dull cherry red. Sparks fell and died on the rubber belting. The smell of hot iron mixed with the smell of the barn, and it was not an unpleasant combination, just the smell of work, the particular chemistry of a thing being opened. He worked for 2 hours before the door gave. It did not swing open so much as relax, a slight gap appearing at the edge, enough for him to get a cold chisel in and pry it the rest of the way. The hinges groaned, and then the door fell forward and clattered on the rubber mat, and the sound of it echoed up into the rafters and out through the haymow vents into the dark Iowa night. Elias set down the torch, turned off the gas, and let the air settle. Then he got his flashlight, a 2-battery Rayovac, the same model he'd carried since the 60s, and shone it into the safe. There was no money, no jewelry, no deed bundle rolled up in a rubber band, which was what some people kept in safes. There was a single object, a rectangular parcel about the size of a hardback book, wrapped in what appeared to be heavy canvas sailcloth and tied with tarred twine. The cloth was stiff, treated with something, linseed oil, perhaps, that had preserved it through the decades. He cut the twine with his jackknife and unwrapped the cloth carefully, the way you'd unwrap something that had been given to you. Inside was another layer, thinner cloth, and inside that, paper. Not new paper. Very old paper, brown at the edges and cream at the center, with the specific texture of something that had been stored with great intention. He carried everything to his workbench and set it under the hanging shop light, a bare 60-watt bulb on a cord. He got his reading glasses from the nail where he kept them, wire-rimmed, the right earpiece repaired with a band of black electrical tape, and he sat down on the bench stool and looked at what he had found. There were two things. First, a hand-drawn survey map, perhaps 2 feet by 3 when unfolded, rendered in brown ink on heavy drafting paper. The lines were precise, the hand of a trained surveyor, the kind of careful draftsmanship that people did in the 1890s when everything was done by hand and done right or done over. He could make out the creek, the old post road, the section lines. He found his own property on the map, labeled in the old way, the Caldwell Quarter, as it had been called before his grandfather bought it in 1912. He found the Baird land, the Garrett land, the land now marked on county plat books as belonging to Richard Vance's holding company. And he found something else. A line, carefully drawn in a different ink, older, perhaps, or a subsequent notation, that traced along the creek from the northwest corner of the map all the way to the southeastern edge, cutting across what was now being called the prime development parcel. Next to this line, in neat copperplate handwriting, were 7 words. Perpetual agricultural easement, water right, all riparian holders. The second document was a land conveyance agreement, 12 pages of dense legal text, dated September 14, 1890, stamped with the seal of the Harlan County Register of Deeds and bearing the wax seals and signatures of the 7 original families who had settled this township. Elias read through it slowly, moving his lips at some of the older legal phrasing, running his thumb along the lines. When he reached Article 7, he stopped. He read it again, and then a third time. Then he took off his glasses and set them on the bench and sat in the quiet of the barn for a long while with his hands folded in his lap, while outside the corn tassels whispered in the night wind, and the barn cats moved through the shadows, and the sky above Harlan's Creek was full of stars. The expression on his face was not excitement. It was older than that. It was the expression of a man who has spent his whole life suspecting that the ground beneath him is solid, and has just had it confirmed. 3 days later, Richard Vance drove his white Cadillac down the long lane to the Garrett farm and parked in the yard, and Tommy came out of the machine shed wiping his hands on a shop rag. Tommy Garrett had been at Iowa State University for 1 semester before his father's heart attack in November of 1981. He had come home to run the farm and had not gone back. He was 19, broad-shouldered, with his father's hands and his mother's stubbornness, and the farm had 2 outstanding notes at the county savings bank, and in 30 days the second of those notes would come due. Vance came out of the Cadillac with his sport coat on and his cigar lit and a manila folder tucked under one arm. He had already spoken to Tommy twice. This was the close. "Tom," he said, "I want to help you out here. I genuinely do. That's why I came back." He spread the papers on the hood of the Cadillac, using his cigar hand to smooth them flat. A purchase agreement. $110 an acre. The Garrett place was 220 acres. The math was not complicated. What it came to would pay off both notes and leave Tommy with perhaps $12,000 and nowhere to go. "This is a fair offer," Vance said. "More than fair, given the market." Tommy looked at the paper. He looked at the yard, the chicken coop his grandfather had built from salvaged lumber, the old Massey Ferguson sitting on a flat tire by the fence, the kitchen garden his mother still kept even though his father wasn't there to eat from it anymore. He thought about how the county assessor had been out last spring and reduced the assessed value, and it hadn't even helped. "I need some time," Tommy said. "Tom." Vance's voice took on the particular patience of a man who is not patient. "The bank doesn't have time. You've been asking for time for 2 months. There's a point where the kind thing, the smart thing, is to take what you can and move forward." That evening, Vance ate supper at Harlan's Creek Diner, which was run by a woman named Darlene who made the best hot beef sandwich in the county and kept the coffee coming without being asked. Vance sat at the counter and ate and talked, mostly at whoever would listen, which was mostly Darlene, who had the gift of appearing to listen without actually agreeing to anything. Vance said that the old way of doing things was finished. He said that the family farm was an anachronism, a sentimental notion that had been economically unsustainable since the Eisenhower administration. He said that people needed to stop pretending that the way things had always been done was the right way, or the only way. He said there would be jobs, real jobs, good jobs, not the back-breaking poverty of trying to make a corn crop in a drought year. He said all of this loudly enough that the whole diner could hear it, which he intended. In the corner booth, Elias Thorne sat with his own cup of coffee, the real kind, the thick diner kind, in a white ceramic mug, and listened to all of it. He ate his Tuesday special, which was pork chops and fried potatoes, and he let the coffee warm his hands. The fan on the wall above the counter ticked every third rotation where the blade was slightly bent. The radio behind the counter was playing something by Don Williams, soft and low. Vance noticed him eventually. You couldn't help but notice Elias, not because he demanded attention, but because of the quality of his stillness. He was the kind of man who occupied a room without performing in it. Vance slid off his counter stool and walked over, his cigar tilted at a jaunty angle. "Thorne," he said. "Elias, how are things over on your place?" "Getting by," Elias said. "Look, I'll be straight with you." Vance sat himself down across the table without being invited. "I like you. Good property. North Fields, good drainage. I'll go 120 an acre, and I'll cover the closing costs myself. That's me doing you a favor." Elias looked at his coffee cup. He turned it once in his hands, feeling the warmth. "No," he said. "No." Vance repeated it the way you might repeat something in a foreign language you don't quite believe. "Elias, you do understand what the prime rate is right now, don't you? You understand that by next spring, you could." "Town meetings tomorrow," Elias said. "Community hall. 7 o'clock. Something in the way he said it made Vance stop. Just for a moment, just a half second where the easy confidence flickered. Then he smiled his city smile and stood up and straightened his jacket. "Sure," Vance said. "I'll be there. Maybe I'll bring my blueprints. Show everybody what progress looks like." He left $2 on the table for a cup of coffee that cost 60 cents, the way he always did, not out of generosity, Elias thought, but out of the habit of making himself visible. Elias finished his coffee. He listened to the rest of the Don Williams song. Then he paid Darlene, put on his cap, and drove home in the dark. The Harlan's Creek Community Hall had been built in 1923, and not much had been done to it since. The walls were a yellow-cream color that had been painted over many times, and the floor was old pine that had been sanded and varnished enough times that it had the smooth, amber look of old honey. The room could seat maybe 80 people in the folding metal chairs that were kept in a closet off the east wall, and on a good night in the old days it had been packed for everything from 4-H talent shows to candidate forums. By 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening in August of 1982, there were perhaps 60 people in those chairs. The Murphys were there and the Hendersons, and Tommy Garrett in the second row with his cap in his hands. Martha Hudgens was in the back with her ledger book, out of old habit, though nobody had asked her to take notes. Several of the men had come straight from evening chores and still had the barn on them, that honest mixture of dust and livestock and motor oil that no amount of washing entirely removes. Richard Vance was at the front of the room. He had set up an easel and a large illustration board with an artist's rendering of his proposed development, a blocky complex of warehousing and commercial buildings, with a small, unconvincing stand of planted trees along the perimeter to suggest environmental consideration. He had brought 2 men in ties with him, who stood to the side like formal furniture. One of them was a real estate attorney. The other was a land planner of some kind. Both had the look of men who spent their time in cities and found the country faintly inconvenient. Vance gave his presentation. He was good at it, smooth, assured, the words coming in the right order with the right amount of sincerity sprinkled in. He talked about jobs and tax revenue and the future. He talked about market realities and economic inevitability. He talked about the courage it takes to adapt to change, which was his way of calling the farmers cowards for holding on. He said that the Farmers' Home Administration couldn't save them, and the County Extension Office couldn't save them, and the grain co-ops certainly couldn't save them. But this project, his project, could transform this corner of Iowa into something that would benefit everyone. And for those of you with notes coming due, he said, setting his hands on the sides of the easel with a kind of proprietary comfort, I have purchase agreements ready tonight. You sign, you walk away clean. No bank letters, no foreclosure filings, no late notices. Clean. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when people are deciding whether to fight or to give in. And then, from the middle of the room, Elias Thorne stood up. He was not a tall man, 5'10", perhaps, though he had been 6 feet once before the years had worked on him. He moved to the front of the room with the unhurried, deliberate walk of a man who has been covering ground on foot his whole life. He carried under his arm a large roll of paper, tied with a piece of baling twine. He set it on the table beside the easel, unknotted the twine, and unrolled the map. The paper crackled as it opened, the sound of something very old being handled with care. He weighted the 4 corners with books he had brought in a paper bag, an almanac, a Bible, a seed catalog from 1979, and a copy of the Iowa Farm Bureau Quarterly. The map lay flat on the table, its brown ink lines steady and precise across the broad sheet. This is the original survey of this township, Elias said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice you had to be quiet to hear, which meant the room had to go very quiet. Drawn in 1890 by the county surveyor, Thomas Alderman, who learned his trade from a man who had surveyed for the Union Pacific Railroad. It is certified accurate as of its date. He paused. Martha, you recognize the surveyor's seal? Martha Hudgens had come forward without being asked, leaning her reading glasses down onto her nose. She looked at the seal in the corner of the map for a moment. That's Alderman's mark, she said. I've seen it in the county records. That's genuine. Elias laid his hand flat on the center of the map, over the parcel where the creek ran. This line here, his finger traced the ink notation, slow and steady, is a perpetual agricultural easement on water access. It was written into the original township founding agreement, Article 7, in September of 1890. 7 families signed it, all the original settlers. It was recorded with the county, and it was never vacated or amended. He looked up. He looked at Richard Vance. The parcel you've already purchased, the core of your development site. It sits on top of this easement. The underground water table that feeds this entire watershed, the water that every farm in this county pulls from. The rights to that water, according to this agreement, belong collectively to the riparian holders. That's every farming family in this township. He let that settle for a moment. Everyone. Vance had his arms crossed now. His smile was still present, but it was working harder than it had been. That's an interesting piece of old paper, he said. My legal team will be happy to. Article 7, Section 3, Elias said. He reached into the chest pocket of his Carhartt jacket and produced a folded piece of notebook paper, which he unfolded with the same unhurried care. He had written it out in his own hand. Quote, no person, party, or corporate entity acquiring title to any portion of the aforementioned riparian corridor shall alter the course, access, or subsurface integrity of the shared water source without the unanimous written consent of all riparian farming interests registered in the township at the time of said alteration. Unanimous. He folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. One farmer says no. One farmer says no, and nothing gets built. The room was so quiet you could hear the fan in the corner, the one with the bent blade that clicked every few rotations. Vance's attorney had come forward and was bent over the map, examining the document with the careful attention of a man who hopes to find a flaw and suspects he won't. He studied the seal, ran his eyes down the boundary lines, traced the ink notation with his pen hovering just above the paper. Elias watched him without expression. The attorney straightened up. He spoke quietly to Vance. Vance's face, which had been working very hard to maintain its composure, stopped working quite as hard. It went to something flatter and more neutral, the way a face goes when the news is not what you wanted and there's nothing left to perform. Furthermore, Elias said, addressing the room rather than Vance, the water access easement functions as a property interest that runs with the land. It transferred to every owner in the chain of title, including, he looked at Vance, you. Meaning, Tommy Garrett said from the second row. He had stood up. His voice was careful, like he was testing the words to see if they'd hold. Meaning he bought the easement too. He bought into it, Elias said. He can't build over a primary irrigation corridor without every farm family here agreeing to it. That's what the law says. That's what that document says. That's what 1890 says. He put his hand on the map again, gently, as if steadying something alive. The people who signed this knew exactly what they were doing. They had been through drought. They'd seen what happened when one man controlled the water. They made sure it could never happen here. It took the attorney 20 minutes. Vance had him in the back corner of the community hall, away from everyone. The two of them bent over a photocopy of the original document that Elias had produced from his paper bag. He had driven to the county seat that morning and made copies at the Register of Deeds office, had them certified for $5 each. The attorney went through the document with a pen, making small marks, checking each article against his legal reference book, which he had in his briefcase because he was the kind of attorney who always had his reference book. People waited. Nobody left. 60 people sat in those folding metal chairs in the yellow cream room with the old pine floors, and they waited, and the only sounds were the fan and the occasional creak of a chair, and once, briefly, the sound of someone blowing their nose. Martha Hudgens refilled the coffee at the side table and stood near the back with her cup and her ledger. Tommy sat with his hands on his knees, looking at the floor. Elias sat back down in his seat and took out a small pocket knife and cleaned his fingernails, which had machine oil in them from the morning's work on the PTO shaft of his old disc harrow. When the attorney came back to the front of the room, he spoke to Vance, and Vance listened, and the room watched Vance's face. His jaw moved slightly, the way a jaw moves when you are being very careful about what comes out of your mouth. Then the attorney turned to the room and spoke in the measured tone of a man delivering a diagnosis. The document appears to be authentic. The easement described in Article 7 would, if authentic and properly recorded, and it does appear to have been properly recorded, constitute a valid servitude running with the land. Any development that disrupts the subsurface water corridor or restricts riparian access would require unanimous consent of all qualifying agricultural interests in the township. I would need to conduct a full title search to be certain, but, he paused and looked briefly at Vance and looked back at the room. I cannot advise my client to proceed without resolving this matter, and I do not believe it can be resolved unilaterally. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Lee Murphy, who was 63 years old and had farmed his family's ground for 40 years and had never once in anyone's memory raised his voice, let out a sound that was not quite a cheer and not quite a laugh, but something between them, something that came up from a deep place, and then several other people made sounds of their own, and the room was not quiet anymore. Tommy Garrett covered his face with his cap and then took it away, and his eyes were red at the corners. Vance had put his presentation materials back in their folder. His cigar had gone out at some point during the proceedings, and he hadn't relit it. He picked up his briefcase and straightened his jacket and walked toward the door, his attorney and his land planner following close behind. He passed Elias's row on the way out. He stopped. He looked at the old man. There were things he could have said. He had a vocabulary for these situations, a set of responses for when things did not go as planned: blame, legal threats, promises to appeal, to refile, to come back with better arguments. He was not a man who accepted defeat easily or gracefully. But looking at Elias Thorne, who looked back at him with a calm, settled patience, the patience of old ground that has been there before and will be there after, something in Vance found no purchase. He was a city man. He knew how to read a room of investors, a table of bankers, a planning commission. He did not know how to read this, or this man, and for a moment he seemed to understand that fact about himself. He walked out without saying anything. The white Cadillac raised a plume of pale dust as it turned out of the community hall parking lot onto the county road, and the dust hung in the hot evening air for a while after the car was gone, drifting over the gravel and the fence lines and the dry corn still standing in the fields. Then it settled back down the way dust does, slow and certain, back to the earth it had come from. Afterward, people stood around in small groups the way they always did after something important had happened. They shook hands and spoke quietly to each other and drank the last of the coffee, and someone brought out a pan of Darlene's coffee cake that had been kept warm in the church kitchen next door. Tommy came and stood next to Elias, and after a moment put his arm around the old man's shoulders the way you do with someone you've known your whole life. The way you do when words aren't quite enough. Elias let him and patted the young man's arm once. "How long did you know?" Tommy asked. "Couple days," Elias said. "And you just—" Tommy shook his head. "You just waited." "Nothing wrong with waiting," Elias said. Martha Hudgens came over with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to each of them. "I should tell you," she said to Elias, "that I was in the county records office yesterday, looking up some old tax receipts. I saw the certification stamp on that easement filing. You know what year it was recertified last?" 1947, Elias said. Martha looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Your father. He found some paperwork when he was settling my grandfather's estate. Thought it was important enough to go get it recorded again. Paid 30 cents to do it." Elias looked at his coffee. "Didn't make a production of it." Martha held his gaze for a moment, then wrote something in her ledger. A small, private notation that she would keep in her basement with all the other records of everything that had ever mattered in Harlan's Creek. The community hall began to empty slowly, people stopping to shake hands or clap each other on the back, the way you do when a weight has been lifted and you need to feel the solidity of another person to know it's real. By the time Elias walked out to his truck, the stars were coming out, the big Iowa summer sky, a full roof of them, the way it looked when you got away from the lights. He drove home with the window down and the radio on. Who was playing the late country program? Somewhere in the middle of the county road, with nothing on either side but the dark fields and the sound of the crickets coming through the window, a Merle Haggard song came on. The old one, the one about working men, and Elias turned it up a little. Not loud, just enough. He turned down the long lane to his farm. His headlights swept across the yard, the old barn, the outbuildings, the grain bin with the slightly dented north panel. The corn was stunted this year. The drought had seen to that. There would be a hard winter and a harder spring, and the rates would probably stay high, and the fight was not entirely over. He knew all of that. He parked the Ford and sat for a moment after he cut the engine, listening to it tick as it cooled. He looked out through the windshield at the dark field. His grandfather had broken this ground with a team of horses in 1912. His father had built the barn in 1922 and expanded it in 1934, the year of the big drought, the year everything was supposed to end. His mother had canned 300 jars of vegetables one summer to get them through a winter when the cream checks weren't enough. Elias himself had been born in the farmhouse and had gone to war and come back to the farmhouse and married June in the yard under the cottonwood and raised their son on this ground and buried June 4 years ago from the same church she had been baptized in. $100. That's what the laughter had sounded like. What an old man's stubbornness was worth to the people doing the laughing. He reached over and got the old map from the seat beside him. He had rolled it back up carefully after the meeting, tied it with the twine. He held it for a moment in his rough hands, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of what it represented. 7 families who had sat down together in the autumn of 1890 and decided, with great care and great foresight, that some things should not belong to any one man. That water, the invisible water that moved quietly through the dark underground, feeding every root and every well and every living thing on this flat, ancient plain, should belong to everyone who worked the land above it, now and forever. They had been farmers. They had known that water is not a commodity. It is a covenant. He set the map back on the seat and got out of the truck and walked across the yard in the dark, his boots finding the familiar ground without needing to see it. The barn cats came out from under the granary and walked with him for a while, as they always did, their shapes moving soft and low through the moonlight. In the morning, he would be up at 5. There was a bearing on the disc harrow that needed replacing, and the south field needed another pass before he could plant the cover crop, and the barn downspout on the northeast corner had been dripping and needed resealing before the fall rains came. There was always work. There was always next season. The land asked for your whole life and gave you its whole self in return, and that was the bargain. And it had been the bargain for every man and woman who had ever turned this soil, and Elias had never for one moment regretted making it. He went inside, hung his cap on the hook by the door, and put the kettle on. Outside, the Iowa stars burned on over the old fields, the same as they had over his grandfather's fields and his grandfather's grandfather's fields, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the plans of men who came to town in white Cadillacs. The land was still there. That was enough.